headquarters, the ballroom A and B.
Today?
Yes. Tomorrow morning we'll be in the auditorium behind me.
And that's what you're doing right now. You're doing exactly what you were.
Second careers, travel a lot, camp with like almost all the nations.
Play later?
Yes,
Good.
absolutely.
Good, good. We'll catch up.
So what do we got here?
How did you guys meet? Sign up. How did you guys meet?
I had a tea party.
I'm going into a slow retreat memory on that one, you know.
That's what they give you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I heard Zane was pretty good.
Bill Glenn.
I'm going home to pick up my wife tomorrow after I race this.
Oh! Hey, at this age, we make no apologies.
No.
That's good.
Jerry?
See ya.
Yeah. Been a few years. Okay. Come through. I'll get the first drink.
Thank you. Okay. I sure.
Not sure what exactly they're doing. They made it very difficult to get to and from your car. Part of it is
Quite a turnout. Yes, this is really great.
Family representative. He's starting to fail. And he's trying to say, I don't feel good.
That's Clark. This is
Jim Hunt. Brother-in-law Jerry.
This is the brother-in-law who came all the way from Michigan. Yes.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Nice for this to take so much extra time.
Good to see you. I'm so pleased that this is coming about. Yeah. Happy birthday.
You'll move to, Marianne, you'll move to the great retirement community.
So do you do high school? Can we help you? Same thing? You got it. There you go, sir. I have more, please.
Just the way it is now, no better. Well,
it's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to welcome everyone here. As we were gathering just outside, collecting our name tags, I was telling others what a great job Jerry Cox did in all the preparations and communications, and I was sharing congratulations with Jerry, and he said, oh, my daughter did all the work, and so we are in her debt for all the wonderful communications. I've been following the emails and looking at the website, and it's so rewarding to have the opportunity to have important figures in our history come back and celebrate 50 years of contributions. We had our commencement from the university just 1 week ago today. That Friday, we celebrated the class of 1963. And all of the members of the class who returned for their reunion marched with the graduates into the quadrangle and assembled on the stage, which is a tradition that we have. The 50-year class sits alongside the faculty and trustees, and I've had the opportunity at that weekend to interact with a large number of our alumni who have made important contributions in their lives and in their careers and have been long associated with Washington University. But many who have gathered here for this special program to celebrate the developments in computer science and biomedical computing have made very important contributions also. Some are continuing members of the Washington University community and the St. Louis community. Others have gone on to distinguished careers in other settings. But thank you all for gathering and coming together, and enjoying each other's company will be an important part of what you do, and at the same time reflecting on the tremendous advances that have been made stemming from the kind of early work that was done right here at Washington University. I'm a scientist by background. I'm not an expert in any area of computer science. I'm a user, consumer, but I think no one can deny the importance of computer science and the kinds of developments with which many of you are associated with. We are depending today on information technology, computer science, computer engineering, software development. We're depending on these advances more and more, and these advances have made our lives better and better. Here at Washington University, I think you appreciate, especially in this setting around us, we have a tremendous program in academic medicine. I'm really proud. I'm an inorganic chemist, so I don't claim any professional understanding really. But as chancellor now for 18 years, I've come to appreciate the extraordinary work that's being done here. We see tremendous advances in imaging science and technology. We see the sequencing of the human genome and the management of massive amounts of data. We've been fortunate to have really talented people follow those who started these developments, and today there are a stunning array of really exciting things happening. Just a short distance from here, we have the data center for the Genome Sequencing Center. And this data center, as many of you would know, is very large and consumes a lot of electrical energy. And when we've shared with lay people, what is being consumed there in terms of energy, it's easy to relate to the Danforth campus, as we call it now. We have a large number of undergraduates who live on what we call the South 40. That's 40 acres south of Forsyth. It's redeveloped in very impressive ways now, but the amount of energy that's associated with our Genome Sequencing Center's data center is the same as that's associated with over 3,000 energy hogs, that is, our undergraduates. And these developments really are incredibly important. One of the very exciting areas that's developing from the work associated with genome sequencing and follow-on work with clinicians is so-called individualized medicine. And Dr. Timothy Lay, working with Rick Wilson and Elaine Martis, have been involved in whole genome sequencing for individuals who have cancer. The kind of work that is involved is to take normal cell DNA and cancer cell DNA, make comparisons, try to find the differences, try to find the relevant differences, and then to develop better chemotherapeutic approaches to dealing with cancer. The bottom line today, emerging from what's been done so far, is it's really not appropriate to think of a cancer as prostate or pancreatic or lung or breast. It's cancer defined by the genetics. And what we're seeing will be will reveal new approaches to dealing with these cancers. And we've already seen examples through the work of Skip Virgin and Jeff Milbrandt, who have led the development of something called GPS. That's not Global Positioning System. That's Genomic and Pathology Services. This is a clinical operation to do genome sequencing to reveal the best chemotherapeutic approach for the cancer that you have. And they have already performed miracles. They're working with the most difficult cancer cases where the accepted procedure doesn't work. They bring these cases to GPS. They do the genome sequencing. They look for the mutations. And they have been finding examples where a person who could not be dealt with is now being put into remission. Miracles are being performed. And I think we're really seeing the tip of the iceberg in what can be done. But the advances that will take place from here are going to depend on advances in information technology. Sequencing is commoditized. Virtually anybody can do it. But what do you do with all the data? How do you make all these comparisons? How do you share the information with others? This is a very important undertaking. I feel fortunate to be at Washington University where these kinds of things are being done, and in some ways we are at the forefront. But there are many other areas that you know more about than I do, where computer science and computer engineering and software development are going to make a big difference. I hope you enjoy your time here in St. Louis. I took a quick look at the bags that provide some information about St. Louis for those who are coming back for a visit. Unfortunately, the St. Louis Cardinals are out on the West Coast. They're the winningest team in baseball right now, so we're proud of that. And for some who haven't been back to St. Louis in a while, the community is really undergoing quite a bit of revitalization, even in the downtown area. And we're encouraging the development of new enterprises here in St. Louis. And I think stemming from the great work that many of you have been involved with, beginning 50 years ago and others who've come along since, new enterprises are being spawned that will appear to be rewarding to St. Louis, because we're a hot spot now in terms of new enterprises being spawned, and especially in this area of information technology. And just one example of a new enterprise that's very exciting, that's been spawned out of Washington University, actually from the School of Engineering and Applied Science, is a company called Answers. If you have a question, this company has all the answers. And you just go to answers.com and you pose a question and they'll give you an answer. And two computer science students, as students, had an idea. And they took a class in the business school, and another alum was teaching the class as a guest lecturer. The Arts and Sciences alum was Tom Hillman, moved here from New York and made his career here starting up new enterprises. The two students, David Karandish, who's the CEO of Answers, and Chris Sims, one of the senior leaders of the company, these computer science people from St. Louis, had this idea, and after the class, the three of them formed the company. And after 1 quarter, they were profitable. Today, Answers is headquartered just north of the university, just north of the Danforth campus, headquartered right on Del Mar, and it's a very exciting development. They have about 150 employees, They have offices in Jerusalem, Israel. They purchased a small publicly traded company called Answers.com, and they took the name. And they have an office in Northern California and in Beijing, China. So it's a global corporation, very profitable. Last year, top line revenue of about $200 million. So computer science and computer engineering is alive and well. We're thriving here. And one of the people that we celebrate in connection with our 50-year reunion is Dr. Jerry Cox. And he himself is involved in a new company, Blendix. And we're hoping for equal and larger success in his and other companies that are being spawned here in the region. So thanks for coming. Thanks for being a part of this community. And I hope you have a rewarding experience for this 50-year reunion. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I'm Mark Rakel, and I came here in 1971. So this is my 42nd year, and one of my important relationships was with people in the biomedical computer lab, particularly Joanne Markham, Don Snyder, Jerry Cox, and Ken Larson.
What are you doing now?
Same thing. I'm working on the brain with imaging devices that were conceived of when I was first here. The first PET scanners were built right outside my door.
So I'm Bob Grubb. I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm still on the faculty at Washington University. I came here in 1965 as an intern in surgery. I didn't really become involved with the lab until 1971 when I was still a neurosurgeon resident. I began working in radiation sciences with Mike Turbogosian's group. So I have been involved with radiation sciences, which is now radiologic sciences, since 1979. So I was involved in a lot of the early cerebral blood flow studies and the development of PET. I still work. I quit operating 5 years ago, but still peripherally involved in some research projects.
I am Shantanu Das. I was in CSL, and I did work under Dr. Moller and Wesley Clark, and my thesis advisor was Dr. Chuang. I did my DSc in 1973, and now I live in Connecticut.
I'm Gerald Johns. I started to work with the Link Group in 1964, and one of my first jobs was to proofread the programming manual. Well, in order to do that, I had to learn how to program it. So I was hooked and stayed there for quite a while.
Hi, I'm Dave Beecher, and I started with the university in 1980 working on positron emission tomography. And what I'm doing now is working on a device to detect age-related macular degeneration in older patients.
Okay, my name is Dave Polite. When I worked at the Biomedical Computer Laboratory, we were developing algorithms for positron emission tomography, and then we subsequently developed the actual instruments, positron emission tomography instruments. And this had a profound effect on my career because I'm still here at Washington University 30 years later, doing things in radiology that are related to the things I did back when I worked for BCL.
Thank you. Plus, he's an excellent volleyball player.
He was the guy. He was the monster who would, you're not supposed to hurt the people. You're not supposed to hurt the opponents.
I never hurt my opponents on purpose.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay, I believe that part, but the hurting part, that was real.
I can't remember why I did that, but I think Oliver needed me to do it.
Hi, I'm Mark Franklin. I worked at BCL with Charlie Molnar for several years. When I first came here to be on the faculty, initially in electrical engineering, now in computer science, and I did a lot of work with macro modules. It was a great time, and the people were wonderful, and it's nice to be back with this whole group again.
What do you do now?
I just retired from the university, from the engineering school 2 years ago, and I still hang out there, still doing some work, but slowly moving away.
Hi, I'm Bob Morley, and I was lucky enough to meet the folks down at the CSL and BCL back when I was an undergrad at WashU, and it was a place of amazement and beauty, and I became enamored with the Link computer, and I cut my teeth on it, and it set me on a path of appreciating computer science. I teach electrical engineering now at the university and have been there for quite a while. Just finished my 86th semester, and I was all launched by my interest in the Link.
My name is Ron Hagan. I think I started at the Biomedical Computer Lab in 1972, and I worked there through for about 12 and a half to 13 years. And it was a wonderful place to work. The folks, I have never worked with a bunch of people that are more interesting and enjoyable to work with. So my first project, major project, was surgical intensive care unit monitoring system. And yeah, it was installed in, as you might imagine, surgical intensive care unit at Barnes Hospital for cardiothoracic surgical patients. But in addition, we had a lot of other smaller projects with various departments around the medical school, and it was a great place to work, and I feel forever grateful for having worked there. I've been retired for 12 years, I guess, since I was 60 years old.
Hi, I'm Phil Berger. I worked at BCL from 1970 to 1976. I mostly worked independently on projects in the hospital. I like to work with surgeons on quick-turn designs. Unlike a lot of my colleagues that worked on teams, I generally worked more or less solo. I spun my first company off of BCL in 1976, involved in automating laboratory equipment, specifically mass spectrometers. I ran my company called Technovent for 20 years after that, and we were the leading supplier of retrofit data systems for GCMS equipment. Subsequently, I formed additional companies, some involved with Jerry Cox, and I continue to do independent research in this field right now. Thank you. Just by pounding it.
Hi, I'm Dave Crowley. I was with CSL for 3 years, from 1977 to 1980. I worked with Charlie Molnar. We had an auditory research project, and it was Charlie was just amazing to work for. My grant ended, and I had to move on to other things. But I remember it was incredible energy, incredible group of people, incredible interactions, people like Howard here. And I don't think it's an atmosphere that can be reproduced anywhere. And it led to wonderful things.
What are you doing now?
I'm retired from the computer field. I work part-time. I teach at University College. I teach statistics and a few neurological courses. But I've been in this field of science and statistics and physiological psychology all my life.
I'm Tim Perry. I started work with lab CSL in 1968, I think, at the ripe age of 20 years old. I, for many years, worked very closely with Fred Rosenberger, who has passed away a few years ago. I barely miss him. He was, I considered, one of my best friends. I really admired and appreciated Charlie. He was kind of a mother hen for the people that he was close to. And he took a very personal interest in all of us. It was a wonderful environment, probably the best environment I've worked in my career.
And what are you doing now?
I am wearing an entrepreneur's hat at the moment, developing technology to keep the elderly in their homes and out of institutions.
I'm Howard Lewis. I originally joined the Link Group back in 1962 at Lincoln Laboratory. Later we moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Went through the Link Development Program, came west with the team in 1964, and stayed in the proximity of the university and Charlie Molnar, West Clark, for the better part of 18 years.
And what do you do now?
What I do today, retired for the last 12 years and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Okay, I'm John Turner, and my official connection with CSL was actually one summer when I was an undergraduate, and I worked in the lab that summer and had a great time. But I've also been sort of indirectly associated with the labs as a faculty member in computer science, where I've been for the last 30 years. So.
Well, I was a struggling medical student, and I heard about BCL, not in St. Louis, but I attended a course at the Mayo Clinic. My father was a Mayo-trained general and plastic surgeon. He told me I would never amount to anything unless I went to the Mayo Clinic. So I went to the Mayo Clinic, and it was terribly boring, and I attended this programming class, and I went all summer long, and I went up to the guy, and I said, I didn't understand a word you said all summer long, and he was pretty upset with me, but it was COBOL. He said, where do you go to medical school? And I told him Washington University. He said, oh boy, are you lucky. And then he named Wesley Clark, he named Charles Molnar, and he named Jerry Cox. And he said, and you don't know about these people? I said, come on, I'm just a freshman. He says, you go back to St. Louis next year and you go find yourself Dr. Cox. And he says, good luck to you. So I did, and it totally changed my life. You know, when I told my father I was going to take a year out to become a computer programmer,
It's wonderful.
that was very difficult moment. I did what I told him I was going to do. Oh boy, was that tough. And anyway, Jerry Cox and all of the people, I mean, if you're around a bunch of engineers and you don't tell them that your latest idea is really crazy, they will solve that idea for you, and then you get some of the bragging rights. That's happened to me over and over. They gave me a swagger that I didn't have before. I live in Torrance, California. I'm a private practice radiologist, still causing mischief.
My name is Dave Bridger. I was one of the first Link programmers in St. Louis, even before BCL had been established. Jerry Cox needed some help writing some programs. The first Link was installed at Central Institute for the Deaf, and I was called in to assist in some programming chores. At the time, I was working for the main campus computer facility, which was a large IBM mainframe computer. And for a long time, I was the only person who knew how to program both the Link computer and the IBM computers that they had on campus. I am now retired. I spent the intermediate part of my career working with the MUMPS programming language, and the BCL worked very hard with MUMPS. And I was chairman of the technical subcommittee that produced the ANSI MUMPS standard at that time. I was not working at Artronics, but I knew the people at BCL. So I've been involved in programming languages, and at the present time I'm retired and essentially not doing too much.
This is the reason I came to St. Louis. This very one. This guy was a role model to me. Absolutely.
That's very nice.
Absolutely. But he was taller in those days.
Right, we were both tall.
Stand up.
And my name's Jerry Cox. This is West Clark.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of the things that happened in St. Louis with computers are a result of this man. He was able to see far ahead.
As a result of this man.
Was we did a lot of work to get the various vendors to understand the value of mining.
So how many hours do I get to talk?
Ask this man. You want to know how many hours he gets to talk? I said ask you.
And I'm not a public.
This initial panel will be chaired by Dr. Danforth. But before we get started, I'd like to mention that we have some folks joining us from distant lands by Skype. And on Skype will be Warner Slack, Dave Long Henry. Warner was in the original group of a dozen LINC participants in the LINC evaluation program. Dave Long Henry, who was at Spear, the company that made a copy of the LINC, the MicroLINC. Steve Molnar, who is the son of Charlie and Donna Molnar, and Bob Greenfield, who we thank very much for his development of the mailing list that got you all here. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. William Danforth, the Chancellor of Washington University during a good bit of the time that the labs were in existence. And I'm very grateful for him for his willingness to chair this session this morning. Bill?
Thanks, Jerry. I'd just like to add my welcome to you all. And I'm so glad you're here and to see all this group who will be celebrating great events in our past, but that are still going on. So thank you. I once said that I was very fortunate that Jerry Cox was at Washington University for each of the 30 years I served in the administration. I always thought that Ibsen had said something about, I hold him to be most moral, who's most in league with the future. And I knew that if Jerry were here, Washington U would be always in league with the future. And all of you here have been part of making the future of modern computing and modern computing for medicine. So Jerry, though, was here for my 30 years in the administration, but he's still creative, still bringing people together, still wise, still making Washington University a great place 18 years after I retired. So I'm going to be interested to see how it is 30 years after I've retired. I have been an admiring and impressed spectator, first as Chancellor for Medical Affairs and then as Chancellor. And all of our speakers that are down here now are pioneers who worked on discovering what few had dreamed of. And here's the plan for this morning. We'll first hear from pioneers associated with BCL, Bill Robb, Bruce Waltz, and Mark Rakel. And then we'll hear from those especially associated with CSL, Ivan Sutherland, Santanu Das, and Garland Marshall. Finally, we'll hear about one of our greats, Charlie Molnar, who, like Jerry, seemed to be thinking about everything. Now, to save time, what I'm going to do is first to introduce the first three speakers associated with BCL, and then I'll introduce the others in turn later. And so as each of you hears your name, will you raise your hand? And when your predecessor is finished, just come on up and take the place. And if your predecessor is talking more than 10 minutes, I'll give a signal. Okay. Nothing happens without resources. And Dr. Bill Robb, right over here, was the right person in the key position at the right time. In 68 and 69, he led the Special Resources Branch of the Division of Research Resources at the NIH. The LINC system was built and put in the hands of creative scientists. Later, I would add, he led in the development of the first integrated array of computer-based tools to study the relationships between molecular structures and biologic effects. Bill will be followed by Dr. Bruce Walsh. Right there, thank you. Graduate of Washington University's Medical School with early interest in PCs. And during his residency at Mallinckrodt Institute of Radiology, he worked with Bill Powers and Jerry Cox on radiation treatment planning. He continued in radiation oncology and is now professor and chairman of the Department of Radiation Oncology at St. Louis University. Then Dr. Mark Regal, he's just professor of everything. Radiology, neurology, and the Department of Anatomy and Neurology. As a world leader in using PET scanning and functional MRI to localize and understand how the brain works, he's viewed and described the human brain at work as it listens, thinks, solves problems, conducts a symphony, or even busily does what we used to think of doing nothing. Okay, so the first will be Bill Robb.
Thank you very much, Dr. Danforth. Good morning, everyone. I realize it's been more than 3 decades since I've been here, and that's clearly been my loss. I'll start with the personal part of this. I made a career choice, heavily influenced by the LINC computer before I ever saw one. I was a graduate student in physiology at the University of Pennsylvania. My mentor was William Yamamoto. Willie was a member of the computer study section. I was the only computer student in the department working with computers, so he would just regale me with all the things he was learning. And he was absolutely taken with the work at MIT, with Wes Clark, Charlie Molnar, the LINC, and I heard a constant stream of that. Willie followed up by acquiring a PDP-5 for the lab, and I spent an entire year putting it through its paces, and somewhere along the way, I realized that what I wanted to do was help make this technology happen, and so I stepped off the classical physiology path, went to the NIH, went to work for Bruce Waxman, who was even more an enthusiast than Bill Yamamoto, and since then have not regretted a single moment of that work. Bruce introduced me to Lou Lipkin in the neurology department at NIH, who had a classic LINC. I spent no more than about 15 minutes in front of it and realized that not only was this the most elegant thing I'd ever seen, but the PDP-5 already had lost something. It didn't quite capture the spirit, even though it had features that the LINC didn't possess. In the LINC, we've got the physical embodiment of one of the most seminal ideas in technology. As the first mini-computer, as you all know better than I, it revolutionized the computer industry. But as the first personal computer, it revolutionized biomedical research. We saw flow a cascade of applications in biomedical research. Much of that led right here by Jerry Cox and Charlie Molnar in radiation treatment planning, for example, and the neurophysiology of the auditory system, and many other things you'll hear about more this morning. One of the most interesting resource activities we funded was at the University of Wisconsin Medical Center, where they acquired a whole covey of LINCs and did all sorts of applications in neurophysiology, but one of the most interesting was taking a particular module of the hospital laboratory, and making it manageable with the dedication of a LINC computer to it. That philosophy, not long after, was adopted at Mass General Hospital, where a group there with Jordan Baruch, Octo Barnett, and others had been fighting that hospital with a PDP-1 and came to realize that if they carved it into modules and dedicated machines to each of those modules, they would make much more progress, and did so. And that was one of the many influences. Other impacts of the LINC and its successors occurred all through the NIH. We didn't see them from the resources program because they were funded by individual research grants, but it was the permeation of the technology through biomedical research which had started and was never going to stop. The link and its successors opened a door for many of us, and once we'd gone through it, our own ideas and imaginations could take hold. And so much of our work was not limited to mini-computers, but rather the realization that this machine that was easy to use in the laboratory could also be useful even if you didn't need the A to D converter. You could still do some very sophisticated computation. One of my most interesting stories was years later, we were funding a resource at Carnegie Mellon University, led by Harry Popel, a computer scientist there who was interested in expert systems and medical diagnosis. He needed a medical collaborator, an informant, as Harry would call it. And the man who stepped forward was the chairman of the pharmacology department there at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, Gerhard Werner. Gerhard told me later that what stimulated him to join Harry was Gerhard's experience in the Link Evaluation Program, then in Vernon Mountcastle's lab at Johns Hopkins University Medical Center. So the fact that the Link transformed the world, both the technology part and the medical part, is beyond dispute. I think all that remains perhaps to debate is, was the Link perfect? I used to think so, but then I fell under the spell of Russell Kirsch. Russell was a computer scientist then at what was then the National Bureau of Standards up the road from the NIH. Russell was my hard-nosed, tough-love advisor on my work with systems for pharmacologists. And one of Russell's favorite mantras went like this: Bill, the technology is not a success when you or the developer says, gee whiz, look what it can do. Nor is the technology a success when some user says, gee whiz, look what I can do with the system. The technology is a success only when the user presents the results of biomedical research that could not have been achieved any other way and neglects to mention the system because he or she takes it for granted. To Wesley and to the spirit of Charlie, I guess the Link wasn't perfect because any of us who used it never could take it for granted. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Cox, Dr. Danforth, for the pioneering work that they did. And everyone knows what Jerry Cox did, but Dr. Danforth really was one of the people that helped back this project. And what I want to show very briefly is how the treatment planning that started at the BCL has evolved almost with a Cambrian explosion of varieties and new brands and new applications. But it's resulted in treatment planning that allows for precision in radiation oncology that never was achievable before. And I want to pay tribute to William Powers. Dr. Powers was my mentor. He was the director of the Division of Radiation Therapy before it was called Radiation Oncology, a true visionary. And I think that was a wonderful symbiosis between Jerry and Bill. Is that true? And the two of you fed off each other very much. Now, into the late 60s, early 70s, radiation therapy was largely done by hand. There was no axial imaging. The PC was the first time that these things could be done in a computerized manner, and the arithmetic, the mathematics of it, which is straightforward but tedious, could be done. It was the first practical, two-dimensional treatment planning system. Before, we had to take individual beams, overlay them over an attempt at some sort of axial representation of anatomy, of tumors and everything. If you used multiple beams, it was tedious to add these up. This was one that was done in a textbook. But this was the first practical way that these things could be done. There was, when the first tomograms started coming about, there was a wonderful synthesis between overlaying these computer-generated images in radiology, diagnostic radiology, with what we were doing in radiation therapy. Bill Powers used to say when the first CT scanners became available at the medical meetings, that the diagnostic radiologists couldn't work their way up to the demonstration because the radiation oncologists were crowding them out. It was just absolutely visionary for us. Now, why is treatment planning so important in treating cancer with radiation therapy? Well, first of all, killing cancer cells is easy. You can give 1 million units of radiation, 1 million rads, but cancer cells are still human cells, and there's not that much difference between cancer cells and the normal tissue. Now,
we have a few basics. The limiting factors are the normal tissue, and we don't have a lot of variables that we use. We can use the total dose, we can use the fractionation, but it's mostly aiming the beams that's most important. And the PC was the first way to do it, and there was an absolute explosion of technologies after that. So in the early 70s, we had the first CTs of the brain. Mid-70s, the first body CT that was introduced right here at the Mallinckrodt Institute, Washington University. In the early 80s, both brain and body MRI became practical. So we made a transition from two-dimensional planning to three-dimensional. You can stack these up and make multiple images. And from that to intensity modulated. In three-dimensional planning, the radiation oncologist, the doctor, designs the beams, tries different dose representations, and comes up with something that he or she deems to be adequate. In intensity modulated, we contour slice by slice the normal tissues, the target tissues, prescribe doses, minimum doses to the tumor, maximum doses to various normal structures, and then by an iterative process, it's not an analytic solution, it's an iterative process, come up with a good solution. I used to tell people that we'll do our best for you. Now I have to say we'll do our optimal for you, because if you ran the computer for a week or so more, it takes hours to do some of these calculations, you might get a tiny incremental improvement in the dose distribution. But we optimize treatments. And then from intensity modulated to very complex intensity to radiosurgery, where very tiny beams are used at very high doses to small volumes. Now, why does all this matter? The higher the dose, the better the tumor control. The higher the dose, the higher normal tissue complication rate. So we've got to minimize those things. And a typical response, I'm going to lapse into a little pedagogical mode, is a typical dose response is basically a sigmoid curve. Now let me ask this illustrious group, why is the sigmoid curve so important in medicine biology? Anyone? Anyone? It's the integral of a Gaussian. That's why the phenomenon occurs so often. Typical of a picture, typical modern radiation oncology linear accelerator. It has a business end, but has what we call leaves, which can shape the beam. We used to do this. Bill Powers devised a way of doing it with cast metal blocks. These can be done in a dynamic way where they chatter across the screen, so when the beam is over a critical structure such as spinal cord, salivary gland, cochlea, something like that, it can actually shield that organ. And we come up with very complex dose distributions. This would be a head and neck cancer patient with various tumor volumes, various normal structures put in, and we can shape the dose. For instance, the spinal cord is a limiting structure in treating a head and neck cancer. If we're trying to say parotid function, we can give a lower dose to the normal parotid gland. If this side is near the tumor, we can't shield that safely, so we have to sacrifice organs like that. But we can go on and shape the dose, get very complex dose distributions, and the computer can expand these. For instance, this would be a frontal view. It shows that the dose to the spinal cord is much lower. Doctors tend to be more visual than mathematical, so we can represent these with various curves and things, three-dimensionally. And radiosurgery refers to the highly specialized technique of using small volumes, high doses, small numbers of treatments. This is a cyber knife that we have across town. It produces pencil beams, and from essentially a hemisphere over the top of the patient, about 1,200 different small beams can be used. We'll often treat a tumor with 400 to 500 different beams that all add up to some very complex pattern. In all sorts of ways. We give a very high dose to the tumor, an acoustic neuroma tumor in the ear. We can, right next to the brainstem, which is very sensitive to radiation, we can give a dose that will arrest the growth of this tumor. We can treat small lung tumors. We've even treated a few patients with one lung. We have a lung cancer. You're running out of options in patients like that. And this all began here, right here at Washington University with the BCL. It's proliferated beyond imagination. And I want to thank Jerry Cox, Wes Clark, Dr. Danforth, innumerable people that I can't mention, how this has changed the lives of many human beings. More lives are saved. There are fewer complications. Consequently, the quality of innumerable people, innumerable thousands, perhaps millions of people have been made, all because of work that started right here because of visionary people at Washington University. Thank you.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here today.
I arrived in this institution 42 years ago, and one of my first encounters was the people from BCL, Jerry and Don Snyder, and my dear friend Ken Larson, who I guess unfortunately couldn't be here today. So they've played a absolutely critical role in the work that I've done and all of my many colleagues. So I thought I would run through just a bit of the history of this to give you a flavor of it. And as I do this, I want you to keep in mind the fact that what I'm telling you sits in the context of a much larger research operation within the Mallinckrodt Institute of Radiology. It is now a complex of many different laboratories and facilities. It's really a massive effort that is contributing not only to the research of the department, but many departments in this university, in the medical center, and on the Danforth campus. Because I've lived here in this something we call the neuroimaging laboratories. It used to be laboratory, but there's so many senior people we had to make it a plural. And I'm going to use it as an illustration of what has been going on here. I came to this university because of this gentleman, Mike Terpagosian, who was a physicist, had come from France to get his PhD with Arthur Holly Compton, and had this vision almost from the beginning that cyclotron-produced isotopes had a role in biology and medicine. And initially, to test that idea, he worked in a laboratory which was a trailer outside of the main campus cyclotron, which, as you know, was put in the 1930s for medical purposes, but was quickly used for the Manhattan Project. And when the war was over, it seemed to have less of a role in medicine, with the exception of Mike Terpagosian. So in this remarkable little laboratory, he initiated experiments that convinced the people in the Mallinckrodt Institute and at Washington University Medical Center that, by gosh, they needed a cyclotron in their presence. And the first one was put in the basement of the Barnard Hospital. What attracted me to all of this was the fact that you could actually study the brain with this regionally. And this is the probe system we had that had 6 areas that you could look at. And using oxygen-15 in water and oxygen and carbon monoxide, you could actually, for the first time ever, get a regional view of the brain's oxygen consumption. And of course, this is critical to understanding not only how it works, but what it costs. And the critical piece of this story was the presence of this computer. When I walked into the laboratory, there it was, with its marvelous little tape drives that went jigga, jigga, jigga when you collected your data. But as wonderful as it was in producing these data, the analysis of this data was all done with pencils and paper because there just wasn't enough memory in here to handle this. But just being able to collect the data in this way was absolutely invaluable in the work that we were doing. But I had not been here more than about 18 months, and this happened. That is, Godfrey Hounsfield introduced X-ray CT. And if I remember this history correctly, the initial response from Jerry and Don and others was, by gosh, we can make a better CT than he did. And so there was this effort to create the algorithms necessary to accomplish that. And little thought initially was given to the idea of PET, but that changed when Ron Evans made the decision that he was just going to jumpstart all of this and buy a CT scanner. And it was in conversations in the office next to me with Jerry in particular that hatched the idea that these marvelous algorithms that these two fellows had developed would be very good for the reconstruction of an image based on positron-emitting radiopharmaceuticals. So PET was born. All sorts of people were involved in this enterprise, but 3 people did stand out, Don Snyder, Jerry Cox, and Mike Phelps. But I think it's important to understand the nature of this environment, which was, I think, really remarkable. I'm a neurologist, And I was brought to Washington University by a physicist to work with engineers, computer scientists, and chemists. This is incredibly unusual to have this eclectic group of people and physically living in the same space. And I think it was that environment, with all of its many resources, that was so critical to what was to develop here. You saw a brief view. This is what I encountered. There was an initial camera called the Terpagosian camera. I never did see it physically. It had been disposed of. This is what I had. This was my recruitment package, this detection device, which we used in the neuroradiology suite with these positron-emitting radiopharmaceuticals in patients undergoing cerebral angiography. But when the idea of PET was hatched, the question is, where do we get the equipment to test the idea? And my only contribution to the building of the PET was to agree to have my prize instrument taken apart and laid on a table, which became PET-2. And that led to PET-3, and if you'd like to see that, it is in our East building today. It is truly an historic piece of equipment. And then our workhorse of many years, PET-6, probably the best instrument ever built in this institution. Now, the work that emerged from that was not only the work of a variety of people, in my case, interested in the brain, but also help from our community. Many of you, of course, knew of James McDonald. You certainly knew about his company, but he had a vision about the brain. He was interested in much of his life about how the brain worked. And before he died, he came to Washington University and said, look, I'd like to support work related to our understanding of the human brain. And by this point, PET, with somewhat more sophisticated computers, was actually creating maps of the human brain. But connecting that with behavior was important, not only to the agenda, but presciently, I would say, important to Mr. McDonald. And he said, we'll give you the money, but one of the conditions is you hire a decent psychologist. They could not have done better than Michael Posner, who was one of the great cognitive psychologists in the world, and came to this institution. And with his expertise and that which we were doing, we made tremendous progress. This paper appeared in 1988 in Nature. It's the only paper I've ever published in Nature in which they asked for the paper. They've since rejected most of my offerings. But I often like to say that this paper represented about 17 years of work, having been published in 1988, of everything from the initial work with the computers to figuring out how to use the PET scanner to figuring out how to begin to map the brain and coupling that with behavior. This was a study of how the brain processes words, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail. It's been kind of an iconic study over the years describing this general area of work. Then MR entered the picture and, of course, has been a dominant force. And without giving you the explanation, much of the background work done with PET here laid the biology background for the use of MR to map the human brain. Well, we all started out on the 6th floor of the Mallinckrodt Institute of Radiology, and things got increasingly crowded up there. And so the question is, where can we go? Now, many of you were probably around here when the A&B bakery existed on Scott. I remember when I was here, you'd walk down the street and you'd smell this wonderful smell of the bakery. Well, there it was, and at some point in there, Washington University and the Mallinckrodt Institute purchased that building and created this, which you will see on Scott Avenue. There was originally a parking lot. This is all, there are laboratories in here, but also multiple machines and other things, cyclotrons and the like. Today, on the 2nd floor, the neuroimaging laboratory constitutes 30 faculty, 100 students and postdocs from 6 different departments. It's kind of like a United Nations of Washington University Medical Center. But we have, there's more to this community than just those people in the East Building. We have connections, for example, with one of the largest Alzheimer's research centers in the world, I would imagine, the night ADRC. This is their faculty and staff, and all of the imaging that goes on with patients suspected of, anticipated of, or just aging in general. All of that imaging now goes through the Mallinckrodt Institute's neuroimaging laboratories in the East Building, and some of this is international in scope. It is also now the center of the Human Connectome Project. This is an NIH organized effort to get a complete description of the general connectional anatomy and functional anatomy of the human brain. It is an international study in scope, but it is headed at this institution by Dave Van Essen. So here's the team here. So it's more than the 30 or so faculty in the East Building, but these are our colleagues and friends, to just give you two different groups. Again, to put in perspective the impact of what started here with people like Jerry and Don and Mike Terpagosian and others, is to just cast it in terms of what this group of people have done over this period of time. We recently wanted to have a look at this. The number of articles that we've collected of the people living in the East Building, close to 1,000. These have been cited by other investigators close to 80,000 times. If any of you in this audience are concerned about something called the H-index, the H-index is a measure of the amount of citations given papers have. And if you're a really established investigator and you have an H-index of 50, that's a pretty decent number. This collected group is 142 without any cross citations in there. So for some of you that is meaningful. We're rather proud of it. And we had the opportunity to compare that is just this group, with cities of our competitors focusing on neuroimaging. And you can see that there's a striking difference. But I think it's the environment of this institution that somehow or other created this collection of people working with a common goal that's been able to achieve this. People often ask, well, what do you do? And because technology has been so critical to this, they often get the notion that we just do technology. And I've thought of various ways to give you a sense of what we really do. And thanks to the Becker Library, they were able to cull from all those nearly 1,000 papers the key words in there. And the size of the words depicts the frequency with which they occurred in those 1,000 papers. And you can see that disease is a big deal, the brain, obviously, imaging. Everything from infants to elderly people to cognition to stroke, you name it, it's on there. I don't expect you to read it, but I just want you to get the sense of the scope of what originated here some 40 or so years ago. The other thing that I find very interesting about all this is that it's occurring not from a bunch of isolated people working on their own thing, but a highly integrated effort across of many people. This is a co-authorship network. Again, it's a network analysis of co-authorship across all of these nearly 1,000 papers. And you can see maybe you can't, it's blurry to me. These are all the different departments that are involved. And this is what you probably should get from this is the fact that within this community, within the people in the East Building and the ADRC and all that, this is an incredibly integrated approach. And I think it speaks to this whole issue of what big science is about and how you successfully do that. Our wonderful little link. This is what it looks like today. There's everything from a supercomputer in here to innumerable other gadgets and devices. And I'm kind of anxious to see us cross the petabyte level of storage, which is within our reach in the next year or two, I think. So what has originated in the BCL and these wonderful people that got all this started is a monumental research effort devoted to what I think are the great challenges in biology and medicine, and that's, of course, understanding the human brain. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to all the first three panelists. I must say you all are terrific, and keeps getting more and more exciting, and more amazing contributions. And thank you also for being brief. We've caught up a little bit on our time problem. So now to the next three. Ivan Sutherland, father of computer graphics, and was responsible for the funding of CSL. He's an often honored pioneer, member of the National Academies of Science and Engineering, recipient of the Turing Prize and the Kyoto Prize in Advanced Technology, holder of over 60 patents associated with many great universities and with companies, and a phenomenal contributor to this whole area. He'll be followed by Santanu Das, founder, president, and CEO of TransSwitch Corporation, former president, Spectrum Digital Corporation. He is honored with an Alumni Achievement Award from Washington University, from which he earned a doctorate in electrical engineering after completing his bachelor's and master's in India. And Washington University elected him to a trustee position, and he's written extensively and holds a number of patents. And closing this next session will be Garland Marshall, professor of biochemistry and molecular biophysics at Washington University, developer of computer programs that lead to understandings of how information is passed among cells. He's a founder of Tripos Associates, producer of computer-aided molecular design software, and Metaphor Pharmaceuticals. He's much admired by academic colleagues and has lectured worldwide.
I first met Wes Clark when I was a graduate student at the MIT Lincoln Laboratory. He had built a marvelous machine called TX2, which was used as a personal computer, although it was hardly portable. And I had the desire to use this to make some engineering drawings. And I went in to see Wes and told him what I had in mind, and that I'd like to use his wonderful machine, and he didn't answer. As you all know, Wes invariably smokes a pipe. He had a pipe in his mouth at the time. He puffed on it a little bit, and I was very nervous. I was maybe 24 years old, and this was, the thing I really wanted to do. So I asked him if he needed more time to decide. And he puffed on his pipe a little longer. And then he said, no. And my heart fell. I said some expletives to myself. It was the end of my dream. He said, no, I don't need any more time. You're on. Well, all right. Wes told me later that he had built TX2 especially so I could do my thesis, which was about computer graphics, and indeed, TX2 was the only machine on which that work could have been done at that time. It was the only machine that had the right fleet of I/O equipment, a cathode ray tube, a light pen, knobs, switches, buttons. And every Wednesday, TX2 changed because they added features. And sometimes in the programming community, the word would go around that the division instruction doesn't work this Thursday. That struck panic in the hearts of the programmers. I ran into Wes later when I was at ARPA. They couldn't get any reasonable person to run the information processing office of ARPA that Licklider had set up, so they kept scraping around in the bowels of the computer industry. They finally found me, age 26, and I couldn't say no because I was in the U.S. Army, and I got orders transferring me to the Pentagon. So I went, and I was there with a budget of $15 million, 26 years old and rather green, And Wes had moved to St. Louis and wanted to do some stuff that I thought very interesting about asynchronous computing to make a scalable computer that could be made very large. But I knew Wes rather well. I was very concerned as to whether I should, knowing him as well as I did, provide funding. George Paik put his arm around my shoulder and said, "You know these people very well. You know they're very good. That's the reason you should give them funding." And I did, and the rest, so to speak, is history. They promised me at the time that they would give me a scholarship to this reunion. I think it was a bribe. And so indeed I have come. The last time I saw Jerry Cox, I called him and said, "I'm riding my motorcycle from Florida to Portland. St. Louis is about a day's trip from Florida, maybe a little more, but a long day. Could I leave my motorcycle in your garage while I take an airplane to go do something else?" And Jerry agreed, and so I had a very pleasant meeting with Jerry. We had a nice meal together, and my motorcycle was safe in his garage for a week or two. For that, I thank you, Jerry. The really lasting result in the computer business that came out of the work of the group that came here to do the asynchronous technology was the understanding of the metastability phenomenon. It is true that if you have a Gulf of Mexico and you have a Pacific Ocean and you have a mountain range in between, there must be a continental divide. And a flip-flop can get hung on that metastable point and can sit there for a while deciding whether to go to the right or the left. Of course, the obvious thing is if it hangs, you should kick it to the right. I had this discussion with Tom Cheney a few days ago, and he said, "No, you kick it to the left." But I think it was discovered here that you can move the continental divide with a bulldozer, but you cannot get rid of it. And so the metastability phenomenon is here to stay. Last week, I was at the Asynchronous Conference for 2013. A group of lunatic fringe-type computer people who believe that clocks are evil gathers each year, and indeed we heard some strange things. A lady from IBM, a fellow of IBM, came and showed us a wonderful chip that they had built with a few billion transistors in it, and it had, count them, nearly 10,000 synchronizers to get signals from one clock domain to another reliably. The world's experts on synchronizers are here in St. Louis, a group led by Jerry Cox and a few other people who understand this phenomenon of metastability. I think that's the principal, very lasting legacy that's come out of the work on asynchronous stuff that was done here, was that understanding that metastability is inevitable. It's widely understood now, but I think little recognized that it came from here. Thank you.
I got a call from Jerry Cox from some 3 or 4 months back, and then he asked me, "Shantanu, are you coming to the reunion?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Would you be willing to say a few words about your experience, personal experience in the lab?" And I said, "Yes." And what I'm going to tell you is my personal experience. By no stretch of imagination, I'm a pioneer. I was just a graduate student. I had only peripheral involvement with Link and macromodules. The first thing I want to say is about my first day in CSL. I arrived in 1969 on Labor Day, and St. Louis Airport was very crowded. I called the campus, and the campus police answered. And I said, "I'm here." He said, "Yes, we got quite a few calls like your call, and I would like to come to the campus and maybe I can stay one day in the dormitory before I can find an apartment. They said, everything is closed, and you should take a limousine to the downtown YMCA. So I asked him, what is a limousine? So he explained to me. Anyway, I ended up one night in downtown YMCA, and I want to tell you, I don't think you want to stay there. Anyway, on Tuesday, I came to CSL and met Charlie. I don't think he was expecting me. And he was very courteous and took me around and introduced me to a number of people, including Wes, Ed McCarty. When he came back to his office, I had to give him a bad news. The bad news was I badly needed some money as advance. And he asked me, how much do you want? And I said, $600. And Charlie was very good in hiding in his emotions, but I could see that this was a lot of money. And I don't think any graduate student ever asked for, on the first day, $600 advance. Needless to say, it was an unusual request. He asked me to wait, then talked to, I guess, to Wes and Ed McCarty. And after half an hour, Ed McCarty came and said, take this piece of paper, go to Brookings, room number, 101. There is a lady waiting for you, and everything has been taken care of. So I go there, sure enough, I get $600. I think that tells all of you about the kindness of people like Wes, Jerry, Ed McCarty. And that was very impressive. And the other reason it was impressive is, coming from India, I knew that to get $600 advance from any organization in India would have taken 50 signatures, at least 1 year. So this was very impressive. Then I want to tell you a little bit about my first day at work. I think Charlie wanted to convince almost everybody to take me as a graduate student. I guess I flunked all the interviews, but somehow Fred Rosenberger, I think, had some mercy, and he said, oh, you can work with me. I said, fine. So on the first day, he explained to me that he's working on something called feed-through problem. As you know, metal gates, the transistors don't saturate, so there is a base-to-collector capacitance, and because of the Miller effect, it gets amplified. So even though one gate is turned off, if the another gate is pulsing, there is a feed-through problem, and after 6 or 7 stages, there was enough energy to trigger a flip-flop. In India, we were trained by Texas Instrument application engineers. They always told us that all these gates work, and we should follow their manual, and everything will be fine. So I was scratching my head that this is designed by Motorola. How could this feed-through problem, be there? So anyway, I was asked to take some pictures, and I'm first day in the shielded room, and I was always clumsy with the lab, but somehow I was trying to do as good a job I could, and the shielded room's door opened, and comes a guy, quite tall. But what was the most impressive thing about him was he had 6 Coke bottles with him. He finished those 6 Cokes before lunch. We both took a lunch break. He comes back after lunch with 6 more Cokes. And he finished it by 5 o'clock. He consumed more Cokes in one day than I did in my whole 21 or 22 years of life in India. I thought that was impressive. After some time, there was an announcement that a guy who is expert in metastability, all kinds of problems, named Ivor Cat, is going to come and give a talk. He had a perfect British accent. I did not know of him, and I'm sure he was very smart. But every time he was about to make a point, he will digress. So I was there for 1 hour. I could understand every word he was saying, but I could not comprehend what is the point he was trying to make. Anyway, fast forward 2-3 years, and somehow I met Ivor Cat again in ITT. I think Charlie Hertzfeld, who was our boss, I think he invited. So again, he was going to give a talk on metastability, fit through everything. Instead, for 1 hour, he talked about how Maxwell was a fraud, and Oliver Heaviside was the real deal. And he asked all of us to join his crusade because he felt IEE, this is the equivalent of IEEE in England, is systematically obliterating the memory of Heaviside. So that guy was very impressive. So through CSL, I came to know a lot of impressive people, but the most impressive was the work they were doing in macromodules. And more impressive were the people behind it. Wes, Charlie, Fred, Tom, Michelle, Bob Ellis, Mary Ellen, Gerald Jones, Dr. Chuang, Maury Pepper, who was always helpful. Anytime I would have a programming problem, go to Maury. He was very generous with his time. Through macromodule, I think the lab proved that the asynchronous design concept works. There were a lot of disbelievers at that time. There are disbelievers now. And I'm sure one day, as Dr. Sutherland pointed out, having 10 million synchronizers and not knowing that this work is all based on what was done in Washington University is unbelievable. I hope things will change. So Dr. Cox asked me, what did I learn from my experience in CSL, which equipped me in my professional life? I think from Fred Rosenberger, who is no longer with us, Tom Cheney and the people, one thing I learned was don't take anything for granted. Don't think what Motorola or TI says is right. Absolutely make sure you dig into it and don't take any chances. This sense of discipline, thoroughness, dig into it. Creative idea is good, but back it up with analysis. I think this was a lesson I learned by observing people like Fred Rosenberger, Michel Stuckey, Charlie, etc. And I can truly say that whatever little success I had in life, it was because of this spirit that you have to dig into things. Don't take things for granted. Thank you very much.
First, I would like to thank the person who's affectionately known by my family as Chan Dan. 3 of my sons are graduates of Washington University. My daughter's a graduate of the medical school. And I can tell you, somehow, and I don't know how, this man created a milieu for doing science and collaborating and getting along without sharpening your elbows at breakfast. That I think is, I came here thinking I would be here 3 years. This is year 47, okay? And it's because of the environment that is here. So, you know, I've started 2 companies in my career. People think that you know something. You know, you're, quote, a serial entrepreneur. And my response to that is good luck. And these are sort of the reasons. I came here, I was a graduate of Rockefeller University. I did my PhD degree. I was the first student of a guy named Bruce Merrifield, invented solid phase synthesis, won the Nobel Prize in '84. If you want to jumpstart your career, start with somebody that's going to win the Nobel Prize. It worked great. Anyway, so I came and I built the second solid phase synthesizer. The original one's hidden in the Smithsonian somewhere. But I had to improve the original. So I put subroutines made with relays. Charlie was right across the hall from me. When I was working on this, he used to come and sort of smile, okay? Not say anything, okay? But ask me a couple of leading questions about what in the hell I thought I was doing. And of course, I didn't know. But I quickly found out why only 1 or 2 computers were ever built using relays. It's called chatter. And I had it big time.
So Charlie sort of took me under his wing. And for those of you who perhaps didn't interact with Charlie, Charlie was one of these people that once you were in his circle, all right, you were there for life. He used to walk me around the block teaching me about Fourier transforms. He arranged for me to learn about logic design with Michel Stuckey. I mean, he wanted me to understand what in the hell I was doing. And so, in any case, so I got introduced to the link. You see Wes here, you know. I forget, I think there were 2K of memory in that box. We built, basically, a compute molecular modeling system called Chemist from the period of 1967 to 71. Bob Ellis, who's in the audience, was very instrumental. Bob Ellis was sort of the guy that taught me about computers, and I taught him a little bit about chemistry. But we built this, and one of the games was we only had 2K of memory. We had an oscilloscope for an output. Every point on the line you had to draw by calculating the coordinates. And so I was really hot to get 2 more K. I showed up at Charlie's office once, and he had this little jig. And he had these little round metal donuts and a bunch of wire. He says, well, Garland, you want 2 more K? Okay, just put the little donuts in the jig, string the wires in there, and bring it back to me. And what did I know? I walked out of Charlie's office, and suddenly everybody was laughing. They got me. And it's not the first time I've been gotten. But in any case, this went on, and you know, I also learned something from Wes. They had a site visit with some very prominent people. Cy Leventhal from Columbia, who was somebody I knew, came out. And these people were, some of them were determined not to fund this, okay? But Wes got up, and they had the boxes for the macro modules. They had the crates. And I saw Wes get up and put things in that crate and take them out and connect the data cables and the whole business to them. And I knew there was no electronics in that box. Amazing performance. I use that whenever I can. In any case, this was built. This was our real, you punch one button and it said display protein. All right? And this was here's the LS1 over here from Evans and Sutherland. Here's the microsphere. I think this is David Shoup. I don't recognize people from the back too well. This is, oh gosh, I think we probably had 16K, maybe 32K of memory. In any case, this was a prototype of a machine that was built to do electron density fitting by crystallography. NIH and George Bickmore is sitting in the audience. George Bickmore got to take this around the country to X-ray crystallographers. Took it to a Gordon conference in New Hampshire, took it, I don't know, I think he built that machine something like 10 or 11 times to demonstrate just how reliable it really was and convince people. And so all these people signed up to get the small laboratory version of this, which was built around a TI computer. Okay. So to make a longer story short, we developed a system we call Sybil, and these are the people, David Barry Hines, John McAllister, Rich Damcoat, I wish he were here. These were the people that were primarily involved in developing this modeling system. And we collaborated with people, particularly at GD Searle, and they were just juiced because they could just pull low-hanging fruit in terms of molecular recognition. They were getting lots of crystal structures of therapeutic targets. They had molecules that they couldn't understand how they twisted and so on to fit in those sites. And suddenly they put things up in 3 dimensions on the screen, and they could just really start to sing. So that was great. The problem was we couldn't give the software away. You know, special purpose machines, academic spaghetti code, no responsibility for taking care of it, fixing it, making it better, teaching staff. So it took me a while to realize that the only way to get it out there to be used was to start a company. So it was started. I sat around the table with my 4 kids. They each contributed $100. My wife and I each put in $200, and we started the company. And it was merged with Evans and Sutherland in 1987. That's basically when that was my way to get out, because I decided that being an academic and being involved with business is really not compatible to my mental health. It was acquired after it spun out from Evans and Sutherland, and it's still in existence. I think they were once at about 150, 200 people. I think they now have probably 6 or 7 people. It's mostly become a data formatting company interacting with pharma. And my bottom line, which you may or may not be see, is if you can't give it away, try selling it. So in any case, this is the lesson I've learned. Never ever do it again. It gets in the way of science. Now, I've made that mistake twice, all right? My wife and I subsequently have a post-nuptial agreement, okay? If I ever do it again, we'll communicate by postcard. And that was mutually agreed upon, but I hate to tell you, and don't tell Suzanne, okay? Because right now there's being a company formed by some other crazy people that want to take something we've been working on recently, using all this technology that's been developed over the last 40 years to really try to understand how a therapeutic target interacts with a drug, all right? The target we were just working on happens to be the eradication of HIV. So I wouldn't say that. It's what's known in the trade as a high-risk, high-reward possibility, you know, but it's got a glimmer of hope. And I think the one lesson that I think will come up with from what we'll all say is dream the dream and make it work. Thank you.
Our closing section is devoted to one of our heroes, Charlie Molnar. Charlie's widow, Donna, whom I think everybody knows, who's been wonderfully committed to the work and keeps up with us all, is with us, and she'll read a piece written by their son, Stephen, and feel free to share any of your own thoughts, Donna. I'll only add here that I had the privilege of meeting with Charlie on occasion, and sometimes with Charlie and Jerry Cox, when I'd sit around trying to figure out what they were talking about. I loved these meetings and the puzzles they raised, but they weren't short and they weren't easy. I once heard that all problems have an answer that is clear, logical, short, simple, and wrong. Charlie never saw real things as simple. He looked deeply and saw complexity. My simple ideas were not convincing to Charlie. And he saw complications I had not seen. So things took longer. One had to look deeper. More hard thoughts were needed. I always came away impressed and more appreciative of why Charlie was the same Charlie who'd found new solutions where others had not. I will not guarantee that what I say is always true, but as far as I know, he was never wrong. Donna?
I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. It was supposed to be my son who was going to be here, and I'm going to read you what he wrote. And this is different from what everybody else has been talking about, because this is a more inside look at Charlie and the laboratories. So these are his personal reflections on the influence of the Washington University labs. So whenever I say I'm Stephen, okay? I wish I could be with you in person today. My experience with the labs is different from most of you. I first experienced the labs as a child who made many trips there with my father on weekends and who got to meet many of my father's colleagues as a small one underfoot. But in my career, I have worked on computer graphics and computer architecture and have come to appreciate in a completely different way many of the techniques and technologies the labs pioneered. As a child, I often overheard my father speaking of the lab, referring to the Computer Systems Laboratory and the doings there. These were the days before the internet and dial-up connections, let alone computers at home. On Saturday mornings, he would often discover that he had left something at work, or some small thing undone, or just needed to talk to a colleague, and so he would head into the lab, and often he would take me with him. It was through these Saturday visits that I got to experience the lab. Probably not as most of you did, with busy colleagues in every office. For me, the lab was quiet, with long hallways and intriguing pipes on every ceiling and wall supplying the steam radiators. There were still many signs of the building's prior life as Shriners Hospital. My father's office was a familiar place with dual chalkboards, always covered in cryptic writing in colored chalk. And yes, there were many stacks of papers. The security guard was ever present. A 50% chance of seeing him at his desk at the bend in the hallway where he could see both directions, or another 50% chance of seeing him at a random spot keying into a DTEX watch clock station. The third floor lab area was my favorite place. I remember the towers of macro modules cabled together with fans running, and was fascinated by the shielded room, which was filled with electronic components. I don't think it was used for experiments requiring shielding very often. I became an electronic hobbyist myself, and seeing the world-class collection of parts here always gave me inspiration. During later years, as I became acquainted with logic gates, flip-flops, and such, I would sometimes borrow Tom Cheney's TTL manual from the shelf and read it, and then carefully put it back when my dad was done. Occasionally, these Saturday tours took us to BCL, where we would cross the bridge and visit with Jerry Cox. Very occasionally, we went to the medical school, where we would risk entrapment in the old elevator, and visit the auditory research lab, where I could imagine and sympathize with the cats tranquilized, lying on their side with their brains wired with electrodes. A Link computer or one of the PDM clones seemed to be ever present when real experiments were done. Oh, and empty Link tape spools made excellent bathtub toys. I met many of you during the lab picnics, softball games, Christmas parties, and canoe trips on the Houssat and Courtois. As a side note, my dad took me on his first canoe trip, invited by intrepid graduate students. We demonstrated our non-proficiency by capsizing about 100 yards from the put-in and had a very cold day with wet clothes the rest of the day. I went with him the next time and the next, but we had a stern agreement about avoiding places where water sweeps under downed trees. When I was a high schooler, my dad still had occasion to come in on Saturday mornings. With more maturity on my part, I began to understand more about what really went on at the labs. Dave Barry gave me and my Scout colleagues a demo of the MMSX molecular graphics computer. I was privileged to be allowed to do a high school project on the PET imager, back when PET had 2 T's, by interviewing and getting a demo by one of the researchers who pioneered this diagnostic technology that requires its own cyclotron and works by detecting the simultaneous arrival of 2 gamma rays that head off in opposite directions when a positron from a nuclear decay encounters an electron and they annihilate each other. After my first year of college, Garland Marshall hired me as a gopher at his new Tripos Associates startup. This was almost certainly at the suggestion of my dad. This was a most awesome summer job. I biked to work each day and shared a desk with the well-used coffee office machine. There I wired up a bunch of joystick boxes and then got my fingers into programming. First a search routine for the Cambridge Molecular Database, and then a semi-successful attempt to integrate a simplex optimizer into the Sybil molecular graphics system. There was a great feeling of excitement and camaraderie in that group. They had fun outings to water parks and camping trips. Bonnie ran a tight ship when it came to the Fortran Common blocks. It gave me my first-hand experience with real-time graphics and seeing computers at the service of real science. I also learned that wire-trap boards were pretty rickety and was fascinated watching their main number cruncher do a space-filling rendering of a protein molecule, one slow scan line at a time. I had a vision of how awesome it would be if renderings like this could be done in real time. My own career has focused on computer graphics and parallel computer architecture. While an undergraduate at Caltech, I took a computer graphics class offered by Jim Blinn, who had an infectious enthusiasm for the area. There I wrote my first matrix transformation and rendering code. I took the VLSI design class from Chuck Seitz that my father had helped bootstrap a few years before, and decided at the time that computer graphics and chip design were the areas for me. I chose to attend graduate school at the University of North Carolina, partly because they were building a crazily ambitious real-time graphics computer, and partly because of the fond stories my father shared of his collaborations there. At UNC, we built special-purpose graphics machines that rendered a poliovirus in real time. In my current work at NVIDIA, we build graphics and high-performance computing machines that render near photorealistic images in real time, are used in the service of science, and now power the world's top supercomputer. The legacy of the labs infuses the work we do. I will just comment on a few aspects that affect me personally. There are obviously many more. First, and I don't have one, but I'm supposed to hold up a smartphone here. There are these personal computers. The ancestry for the PC is complicated and controversial, but the personal nature of the Link and its graphical user interface were certainly influential. Then there's computer graphics, without which NVIDIA would not exist. Third, as we build high-performance computing engines and systems on a chip, we wrestle with dozens of independently clocked and rail-gated domains and must engineer around the glitch that my father and his colleagues discovered and explained. For every new silicon process we use, we characterize TAW and design a family of clock-crossing modules. In our GPU and SoC architecture, the intrinsic uncertainty and latency required for robust clock crossings influences our decisions of where caches reside and how requests get to memory. The influence of the labs is present in everyday life, but it is present in a very central way to me. I feel privileged to be a child of the labs, and am grateful for all of your influence and friendship, and am grateful in very many ways to my dad. And I just want to thank you all for this opportunity to read this from Stephen and to tell you what I really liked in this particular thing is how important the emphasis is on the use of computers in science and medicine, because that was so important to Charlie. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all the speakers, and I think all of us appreciate what you've said, the picture that you've drawn of the past here, and how much it's meaning today. And I think we should give another great round of applause and for these speakers, and then you can all stand up and go for coffee.
Well, we have a panel assembled here to answer the questions that you've always wanted to ask. We'll also include questions from the last panel because we have most of the participants, if not all of them, in the audience, so they can respond to questions that may have come up with regard to those presentations. So we have on this panel Lou Thomas sitting here. Lou was director of BCL following my tenure as director until 1996, 6. Next is Severo, who came with Wes's group from Boston, and then decamped to help build the internet, and so we're happy to have him back to talk about it. Mary Ellen Wilkes, who we all remember fondly for her development of the Link Assembly program and for many other things. Next is Maynard Engebretson, who was one of the original crew that assembled at the Central Institute for the Deaf and then trudged down the street from Central Institute to the old Shriners Hospital nurses' quarters when we founded the Biomedical Computer Laboratory. And then Don Snyder. Don came here from MIT, joining the EE faculty and the Biomedical Computer Lab, and has done many wonderful things for the university and for science, and I'm proud to say, is a good friend. And next to Don, of course, is Wesley, who we're all pleased to have here when we are talking about the link. And Maury Pepper, who's been a tremendous help in getting this reunion together, and so I thank Maury for that. And finally, John Matthews, a longtime member of CSL, who will be able to answer some of your questions about how things really happened. So we sent out a call for questions. The response was thin. I took the liberty of soliciting questions from folks whose arms I could bend. And so I have a few that I can intersperse along here, but we would really like questions from the audience. So while you're thinking about that, I'll lead off with the first question to Maynard. What was HAVOC, and why was it important?
So the HAVOC was a special purpose computer that we built for Hallowell Davis and installed in his lab in 1962. He used it for many years to study the use of auditory evoked responses as a hearing screening test for infants. The HAVOC was designed to compute statistical properties of bioelectric signal. It had 5 computational modes: average, amplitude histogram, latency histogram, interval histogram, and ogive. I couldn't find a picture of it, so I'll briefly describe what it looked like. It consisted of 2 relay racks bolted together, one about 4 feet tall, the other about 2 feet tall. The tall rack contained the logic bay, the power supply, the operator control panel, and an oscilloscope. And the shorter rack contained interface electronics and an echoing plotter. We built 4 HAVOCs in total, in addition to the one for Davis. Don Tees used one to study auditory nerve properties at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and Jim Satterfield used one here in the medical school. The development of HAVOC was important because Davis's research with it led to national testing of hearing impairment of all newborns. It was an early example of applying computer technology to medical research also, and it served as an example of collaboration between engineering and medicine. Furthermore, it provided me with the opportunity to design and build a computer, which was really neat.
The name HAVOC, of course, is an acronym, and I think one of my enjoyments through all these years is creating acronyms. I spent a lot of time at it. They have to be pronounceable and have some relevance to what you're doing. And I think HAVOC for histogram, average, ogive, calculator, although most people don't know what an ogive is, it really is relevant. Okay, so Rex.
Yeah, well, speaking of acronyms, as a young graduate student, you came into the labs and you were handed the link manual, but I want to know who was the expert on lust at the computer labs. I think she's up there on the panel right now, because I remember her name being on the lust manual. I was intrigued by that name, and I was opening up the book, hoping to see something far different. That was a great acronym. Thank you.
Mary Ellen, do you have a response?
The link utility system wasn't mine, but thank you. It was Mike McDonald's, yes. But yes, it is a good acronym. What?
Who was responsible for that?
Mike McDonald at BCL. Yeah, he took off from lap 6, and I think I can't really speak to what he did, but Jerry probably can. No, he's coming.
Hi, Jerry. Barry Heeb. I'm curious, how did you guys end up here in the first place? What's the story about that?
How did you get one?
Well, I guess there are two parts to that. There's how I ended up here, and I'll tell that. And then Severo can answer about how the group from MIT ended up. I was living in Boston working for Liberty Mutual Insurance Company in noise control after I had graduated from MIT in 1954. And one Sunday afternoon, Hallowell Davis, who was director of research at Central Institute of the Deaf, came to my door with his wife and visited with my wife, Bobby, and I, and said he would like me to come to Central Institute to be in charge of their electroacoustics lab. At that time, I knew nothing about computers. Hallowell Davis was such an impressive man that I had met on doing committee work that I said in my head, yeah, I'm going to do that. But it took me almost a year to actually get out here to St. Louis at Central Institute for the Deaf on September 2nd, 1955. And I really loved it there in the research department. One day, Hal Davis asked me how to build a machine to do evoked response audiometry. And fortunately, Maynard was able to do that, built the Havoc, which got me involved in computers, and that's how I got to BCL. Severo, why don't you tell a little bit about how the group came from MIT?
A number of us who were at MIT decided for various reasons that we should leave there, and we were casting about around the country for where the work we were doing with the link would be most suitable. And one of the places to which we came, I remember Wesley and I came for a visit here, and we had decided that the best way to decide was based on our personal tastes, and at the time we were both very much into raw mushrooms, eating raw mushrooms. And so we decided to sample the local restaurants, and we went to one and we asked the waiter whether he could give us a raw mushroom salad. And he clicked his heels and said, "Just a minute." And sure enough, produced a lovely set of mushrooms on lettuce with lemon and the usual important things. And we looked at one another and said, this is a reasonable place. And so in my estimation, that's one of the major reasons that we ended up here at Washington University. Now, Wesley may have a slightly different view of things.
Mushrooms, yes. And right, you had to go to the same restaurant twice to certify that it was actually a good restaurant, to see if they could do the same thing twice. And sometimes the results that they would bring out would be appalling. I mean, in various restaurants of the world, and well, you know, canned mushrooms, or sorry about that, you know, we only have canned mushrooms, but they would claim that they were bringing it out. And I say, well, thank you very much, and then you go on or never come back to that one, whatever it was. So that was just and the question, what was the main question, Jerry?
Why we came
From
MIT.
Oh, that's very simple. Jerry was here. We came because Jerry was here.
Well, I think there was a fellow by the name of George Paik that I remember as being sort of involved too.
Well, yes, of course. The reason he was involved was that Jerry, who was a member of the Link Evaluation Board or team, what was that called? Link Evaluation Board, right, Jerry?
LEP, Link Evaluation Panel.
Okay, panel.
Because we were lepers.
Okay, well, in any case, he was privy to some information back in Cambridge in the very busy summer of 1963, when we had various selected biomedical researchers come to MIT for a, what was it, a 3-week, 1 month training course? 1 month training, or?
1 month each group.
1 month each of 2 groups. And we and the government authorized 12 links to be made. And the point was to take have these people make their own links. One of the old, Jay Walter, are you in the audience?
Yeah, he's stepped out for a minute to rest.
He stepped out.
I was there in Boston, but I went with him. I was playing on the street.
Okay. Well, all right. Jay Walter was among the awardees of the 12 selected people to come, as approved by NIH, with the support of one of the great civil servants of the history of the United States, Bruce Waxman, and with the collaboration, therefore, of Bill Raub, Dr. Raub over there quietly watching the proceedings. And we had the funds to do 12 of these things for an evaluation program. And we were up to that, and Jerry came and helped out at one point because we were stuck, and he was familiar with the work we were doing and believed in it, and he had some expertise in electrons. Charlie knew every known electron in every electron in the known universe by name. But Jerry had some special expertise and came to help. And so I remember Jerry standing there. Well, he knew it anyway. He knew that we were up for grabs. I mean, MIT had just fired me for the second time for insubordination. And although this is true, the whole story is there were 3 times altogether. We're looking around for a place that we could settle down and continue the work. And we never found one. Well, we talked to a lot of college presidents and boards of directors and chairmen of boards and so on, but it wasn't until George Paik showed up, and he climbed up, sat up on a bench like this in our Kendall Gardens lab for some name or other, very very fine name, and said, well, he thought he'd come by so that we could look him over. We could look him over. Wow! I mean, this was something. And so that and the fact that we knew Jerry brought us to St. Louis. End of story.
At one point in the spring of 1964, I got worried about whether the grant application that Wes and Charlie were working on was coming along in time to be submitted so that they would have funding when they arrived. This episode is now known to history as the prime number drop. I, unannounced, flew up to Boston and walked into Wes and Charlie's office in the front of Kendall Gardens there, and found them arguing about whether 2047 was a prime number or not. And Wes had been working on trying to figure out the factors of 2047 and said so far it was prime. So I said, now you guys are supposed to be working on this grant application. I'll figure out whether 2047 is a prime number or not. Went to another room, took up where Wes had left off, and came back a little while later and said, yeah, it's a prime number. Charlie stuck out his hand and said, you want to bet? And we agreed on the stakes, which would be dinner at a fine restaurant in St. Louis of their choice. And as Charlie and I shook hands on the bet, Wes looked down at the paper where he had been computing the numbers previously and said, uh-oh. And so it turns out, of course, it was compound, and it was 23 was the factor that had been omitted from the calculations. So I have harbored the delusion for years that this was a big setup, and hence the name prime number drop. But maybe it was all innocent.
No, it was not a scam. Charlie insisted that it wasn't a prime, and because he knows things like do things like that, and I was working in octal numbers, and it turns out in the octal base you can quickly decide that isn't a prime.
So I know that there were the two sets of how many Link computers were built. There were the first group of 12 and 63 and the second group of 12 and 63 that came, and then the microlink came out in 65. Were there classic links built and sold and used in 64? How many links are there out there, were there out there? And where are they now?
Well, there's several here in St. Louis in various states of repair. There's one at the DigiBarn that is operational, or at least last I knew it was operational. There's one in storage at the Computer History Museum, and you have one. Beyond that, I'm unaware, but maybe others on the panel know about it. We have that here. In fact, you can see it this afternoon. And the NIH Museum has one, according to Bill.
How many were there?
Well, in that original batch, there were 12 official and then 12 that just happened to get put together. And then I think there were more made by Shippey at Iowa. And then there was a set that were made in the classic Link style by DEC that then yielded to the Link 8. Severo, you have more details?
I was just going to mention the Link 8 because it was a mixed version of the PDP-8 and the Link.
So does that answer, Dixon, does that answer the question, or you want more?
So I guess we don't really know. There were 24, and then something more was made.
Right.
I guess we don't know beyond the 24.
I think the answer is nobody knows.
That's amazing.
Yes, another question.
Yes, I heard in the presentations, and I can see by looking at the panel that there's a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of the backgrounds and the disciplines from which people in biomedical care lab and computer systems lab came. And I wonder, was that unusual, and do you attribute the success to the diversity?
I can only answer for BCL, and maybe Wes or Severo can answer for CSL. Well, when I came to Central Institute, I recognized that there was another way of thinking other than what I'd been taught at MIT, and that it was valuable. And certainly Hallowell Davis was instrumental in making that clear to me. And so that broadened my view of who might be useful in BCL, and so we did have an eclectic mix of people. Severo?
If you'll cast your mind back to 1950, you'll realize that the world was a very different place back then. When I went to work at Lincoln Laboratory, there were hiring people to work on the beginnings of the air defense system that was to be based on a computer for the first time. They were hiring everybody, anybody who seemed to have a skill that was reasonable. And the backgrounds varied from violinists to biologists. I was a geologist. People came from all branches and disciplines, and if they had the kind of thinking skills that were required for programming, they got hired. And that's how I got into the computer field, really. So I think that the answer is that back in the early days, depending on your definition of early, people had come from a variety of disciplines and learned by doing often. I certainly was in that category. And so I think it's not surprising that there was quite a diversity of backgrounds in the people that joined the group and just learned by doing.
Can I add?
Mary Ellen, yes.
I'd just like to add to that. We certainly did all come from different backgrounds because there was no such thing as a computer science background. There weren't even any courses in computer science. When I was first hired at Lincoln Laboratory, my qualifications were that I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate. My qualifications were that I had had not one but 2 logic courses. And that put me head and shoulders above the geologists and so forth, and the violinists. And we did all learn by doing, but the upshot of that, speaking to the diversity, is we were all thinking outside the box. Whatever box we came with, we were outside that in this field. And I think the diversity did, in that sense, make a huge contribution because we played off each other every day, 24/7, for the whole time period.
I think that question leads to one which I had on my list of pat questions, and I'm going to ask Lou Thomas to comment on how did the collaboration between BCL and the Washington University School of Medicine work out, and some of the history there.
Well, first of all, to refer back to the diversity question, I think diversity was critical to the success of the labs, but not just because of the diversity in technical knowledge and skills, but also the diversity in the realm of what should one do with these gadgets. I came into this very much as an outlier on the diversity spectrum. I knew nothing about computing. I was never any good at math, but I was doing biomedical research. I was interested in the respiratory system. I had conjured up a rather complicated model of the interaction between ventilation and perfusion of lungs, and I had no way to solve it. So I went to the engineering school, talked to Sal Sutera, no, first Erwin Rodin, I recall, and he put a graduate student on it for a summer, but was unable to solve the problem. So all that ended up doing was draining some of my research funds. But then Sal Sutera suggested that a different approach might work. And so he put a graduate student on it, and he came up with a perturbation analysis that worked like a charm, but then I needed to implement it in some way, and so he introduced me to the PACE analog computer, which was another financial disaster because every minute I used it cost my grant money, and I spent most of my time trying to figure out which adders and multipliers were defective and which weren't. It was a mess. And then this operation called the Biomedical Computer Lab appeared, so I ventured across the street, talked to Jerry about my problem, and he reassured me that in spite of my background, that I could do something useful there. So I took some courses and gradually got introduced into the culture that he had established there, which was very diverse enough to tolerate people with backgrounds like my own. And so I gradually worked into it and found over the years that Jerry had established an operation with so much talent, of such diversity and such robustness that it eventually survived a subsequent 30 years under my direction. And so most of my time, in fact, to get back to Jerry's question, was spent interacting with collaborators. Because from our point of view, particularly at the BCL, the key to all this was what do you do with these things? And at the time, computing was just beginning to emerge as a potential tool. Most biomedical scientists were pretty much unaware of it. They thought computers were magic. I spent a good bit of my time trying to convince any potential collaborator I was talking to that computers were not magic. You didn't put your data in one end and out the other end came a Nobel Prize winning paper. It just didn't work that way. And along the way, my colleagues had taught me about such things as sampling theory and whatnot, and so I was able to try to get a handle on exactly what the potential collaborator was trying to learn, what kind of data was available, what would be necessary in the way of frequency of sampling or precision of sampling in order to get reasonable answers to their questions. And so that formed a lot of the activity that consumed my time when I wasn't herding cats trying to get grant proposals pulled together. But I think what the labs did was very important in giving, particularly at the Washington University School of Medicine and some of the engineering school, a leg up on their competitors by introducing them to a powerful tool that could get them to think differently about the problems they were addressing, and in a way that was more productive than that of their competitors. And a number of them had expressed that a sincere thank you for their having gotten a leg up on it. So that was the nature of collaboration, and I think that was, to me, from my point of view, the real importance of the technology that was, to me, dazzling and actually still is. But as for many things, it gave the biological scientists a new tool in which they could do things, measure things, analyze things that they couldn't do before. And it's such technologies, if you think about it, have been underlying many of the major advances in biomedical science. And computing on an interactive way was one of those. So.
Thank you. And another question from the audience. Rex again.
Yeah, one of my first jobs was to do some work for Sid Goldman in the neurosurgery group. And my question is, who started that? Why was there a link on the 8th floor of the McMillan building? Where did that come from?
Okay, the question is, why was there a link on the 8th floor of McMillan? And I think I can answer that one. being on the link evaluation panel, I knew this program was coming forward. I had known Sid Goldring, who was then head of neurosurgery, through interactions at the Central Institute for the Deaf. They had a wonderful weekly seminar series, which introduced me to all aspects of medical research, including both presentations and visits by Sid Goldring. And so in conversations with Sid, suggested that he might submit an application to this program that was soon to emerge. And he did, and was one of the selected participants in the summer program of 1963 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So Sid, with his technical assistant, Bud Simpson, went to Cambridge, and I think Wesley or one of you commented that it was hard to understand how this guy could be an expert neurosurgeon, but his ability with a screwdriver was questionable.
The only grant that had a clinical application of those ones that were given to NIH, at least that's the history that would relate to me. And that they wanted a computer specifically to match sensory potentials, which was a huge number crunching problem that actually a lot of the development of that had taken place earlier at Washington University. So they actually got that so they could use it for functional cortical localization during cranionics, specifically in patients undergoing surgery for intractable seizures.
Yes, and I think Rex, you participated, and Severo also participated in writing programs for that application. Were there any others that were writing programs for YouTube?
Harry Akers came along later on and did some work. I think his name was on the list of searchees that nobody ever came up with.
Yeah. Harry Agris participated. Severo?
Yeah, I worked with Sid, Howie Lewis, and I worked with Sid right in the little chamber above the operating room. And that was the first time that I'd actually watched surgery taking place. And it was pretty dramatic surgery for me, but... I'm sorry?
They used to put me in the operating room with my multiplexer and watch this open flap and all this business.
Well, I remember one incident, as a matter of fact. Sid was sitting up there in the, whatever you call the thing above, the part above. And while we were watching, the surgeon that was operating suddenly tore off his gloves and appeared to be angry about something. I couldn't make out what. And he was just clearly furious, and everyone was backing off, and I thought he'd lost the patient, perhaps. But Sid said, no, he just didn't have his coffee this morning, and apparently someone had bumped him, causing him to have to stop and go off and get completely re-cleaned up and before he could continue, and he was really furious about having been bumped.
That would have been Henry Swartz.
Yes, yeah.
He was the chief of neurosurgery, actually.
Yeah, that's right. I misspoke earlier. It was later that Sid became chief.
Oh, Sid, by the way, Sid said to me afterwards, after he saw what we could do with the link, he said to me, he came in one morning and he looked quite depressed, and I asked him what the trouble was, and he said, you know, I figured out that my next 5 years of research are going to be done within the next 6 months, and I can't figure out what I'm going to do for the next 5 years.
Bruce Walls.
Please flesh out this history. As I recall, the PC computer, which was what we actually used for the first radiation therapy planning, was a class project that used much of the architecture that Dr. Clark had commented in the link. Can you flesh out that history?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I approached Wes shortly after he arrived, saying that I thought we ought to have a computer architecture class, and I hoped he would be willing to teach it together with me. And Wes said, well, the only way to teach computer architecture is to build one. And I thought that was a startling idea. But we thought about it for a while and figured out, well, maybe we could do it. So we had the first section of the class was describing the theoretical background for computer design, and then we reserved 4 weeks at the end of the class to actually put the computer together. This was to be built with DEC modules, and so we called it the 4-week wonder. It was the time of the program. This was the week that was, and so abbreviations like 4W2 for 4-week wonder were in the air. So we called it the 4W2, and one of the pictures on your program shows Severo and I peering through the frame of the 4W2. Well, it got to work, not in 4 weeks, but in 5. So that was still okay. The class was terrific, and a lot of them claim that they learned a lot from that class. One of the class members is here, Bill Girth, and Bill, as a class project, showed some isodose curves used in radiation treatment planning. Maybe Bill can fill in some of the details here, but I got a Polaroid photograph of a screenshot and showed it to Bruce Waxman. And Bruce, as you remember, was one-of-a-kind government official who we happened to be fortunate enough to be guiding our program at that time. And Bruce said, wow, that's terrific. Here's $250,000 to make a program out of that. And so that's how that began. We decided that we needed to beef up the computer a little bit more. It was certainly in the Link mold. Out of that came a machine that we called the program console, or PC. So we had those initials first. When IBM grabbed them later on, we decided that we wouldn't fight them. So they were able to take over those initials. So does that answer the question? Bob?
Yeah, it was also the 6-week one, because the second one, we didn't finish the logic design in time, and so ours was built second, and it took 6 weeks, and we called it the 6-week wonder. I wrote, the original machines didn't have any mass storage, and so they were dependent on another computer to be loaded. And I wrote the program to go in the wonders to do that loading. Mm-hmm. And I had to toggle it in. I figured out how big it was. It was, small program. It was the only program I've ever written that worked the first time. And I was so careful with that thing. The other thing, I'd like to see the hands of people who are in that class or were associated with it. Bill. Where are we?
Jim Leonard from McDonnell Douglas Boeing was in that class and recently received the Alumni Achievement Award at the engineering school. So he's another one, but I don't see him here. So there was Dave Bridger, Bill Girth, you.
One of the key aspects of that started was that the 4-week wonder used as an output device a brand new Tektronix storage display scope, because the previous on the Link you had to keep refreshing the screen, it'd go away. But the storage display scope remembered what you wrote on it, which meant the program is now relieved of the necessity to keep refreshing the screen. This made it possible to put on very complex pictures on the screen, and they would stay there. And one of the pictures, as you already mentioned, was that the isotope, the beam pattern, something like that, was put on the screen. And that meant that you could now have a small computer which would display complex pictures, and therefore it was reasonable in order to start doing complex imagery and manipulation on the screen without having to worry about having a computer fast enough to keep the screen always refreshed.
Bill, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I completely agree with all the recollections that have been stated so far. Yeah, I remember you're asking me, Jerry, to see if I could put some isodose contours, and as Dave mentioned, the storage scope was absolutely essential to that process. It just would not have been practical otherwise. But it was a great time, and I also want to confirm there were really two computers that were built, and one was the 4-week wonder, and one was the 6-week wonder. So that was a very stimulating time in my early exposure to computers. It was really a lot of fun and a great feeling of group process that we had during those days.
Bob, do you have any other comments about it?
Well, I had, before coming here, I was at IBM for a while. We were working on one of the Sage computers, and so that was my first experience, primarily as a programmer, but involved in the process of bringing up a new computer. So I was really enthusiastic to be more involved in that process with the 6-week wonder.
Yeah, it's really exciting to. Yeah, it's exciting to, in those debugging moments, to see it come to life.
One of the things, the 4-week wonder, after the PC, the later enhanced PC was started in development, ended its life being used as essentially a message communicator. We set up a project to send data from BCL over telephone lines to the mainframe, which is on the main campus at the particular time. We took the 4-week wonder and wrote a program. I wrote the program, which allowed it to accept the data and feed it into this IBM computer as though it were a tape drive on the IBM computer, which meant that we could capture the information directly. The IBM computer would do the dosage calculations necessary, since the PC and so on were not capable of that. It would turn the data around for imaging and send it back down the telephone line and draw the images on the screen. So we had essentially a mechanism for doing data transport from when they took the data originally, did the necessary dosage calculations remote, and then sent it back.
Yeah, and I think that underscores the fact that IBM computers at the time, IBM computer designers at the time, had given no thought, essentially, to I/O of eclectic variety, only the standard things like tape and card reader and so forth. So we had to fake out the IBM architecture.
Somebody should also mention an interesting thing called the data master. At the time, we were searching for, or Jerry was searching for, a method of mass storage on the PC, which was not as complex or as expensive as the link tapes, which worked well enough, but were very expensive. And Bell and Howell had a device called the Language Master, which allowed a language student to record a phrase on a card, which is sort of like an IBM punch card, only somewhat larger, with a magnetic strip glued to it. And one could then play this back. So you could essentially, for language purposes, you could have several phrases and listen to the teacher and then listen to yourself and so forth. Well, that was adapted to be a data storage device for the PC. And you had all these cards, and that gave you essentially random access by having a deck of cards and pulling out the one you wanted and feeding into this particular, into the computer.
And one of the advantages was that it used the same equipment as was used to modulate the signals over the telephone line. Therefore, it didn't add much cost to the computer itself. So it had a telephone modem, and you're able to store data in that particular fashion. And it worked, pretty much.
After Maynard did his magic on it.
Yes. Including chicken bones that he waved over. Yes, please, question.
I've been a computer history person for a long time. I worked with a GE time-sharing computer and a teletype from high school in 1969. So to some degree, I was 5 years old when you all were pioneering the industry. I have a question about the MIT Lincoln Labs with DARPA, the defense industry. It seems to me, this is just my gut feel, that Washington University had a diverse medical, more humanistic use for computers, however that came about. Whereas I'm guessing that MIT Lincoln Labs had a more defense industry posture that maybe had short-sightedness or tight control from Pentagon budgets or whatever. And I also came to WashU on the National Defense Loan, 3% interest money to go to college. So, you know, one of the reasons I came to Washington University was because the Russians launched Sputnik. So again, could you speak about the Lincoln Labs philosophy versus coming to maybe a more open, broader, diverse university, Washington University, with humanistic and medical uses of computers?
Well, I'd like Wesley to respond about Lincoln Labs' response to the development of the Link.
Tom Sandel, who was later the chairman of the Department of Psychology here at the university, came with us because he had been a member of a group at MIT with which Charlie worked at the time under the later to become provost Walter Rosenblith, and they were working on an auditory system technology and understanding the auditory system from the technological point of view. What you could do anyway in those old Quonset huts that were set up during World War II to help the British develop, by developing radar. It wasn't when we got kicked out, it was what was Lincoln Laboratories' role, or what were they doing? They were a military operation. They were, it was a defense laboratory, set up by the Department of Defense to help with the manned bomber problem. We thought that manned bombers were coming over the pole, you know, in those days, and were going to attack the United States. And in Lincoln Laboratory, being a defense operation, and Tom Sandel, having been a member, not quite a member, but almost a member of the group. Yes, he was at that point a member of the group that I had hired to do some work with the TX2, and he wanted a wet laboratory next to the TX2, not surprisingly, so he could continue his studies in electrophysiology directly in the auditory system, and or the outer bounds of, say, and cochlear nucleus, and the laboratory. The request went up to the laboratory management, and they said no. That's all. We are a defense department, and you want to have NIH support? That was what it would be, because Bruce Waxman and, as you know, Bill, had put forth this support as a possibility, and Bill Papian was a member of that, one of those committees that Bruce had organized to help out to evaluate what impact computers would have on medicine and medical research. So it seemed like a good thing to do. At that point, the laboratory said, no, you can't do that. Well, but they did have, they said, you could go, what did they tell me? They said, you can continue the work. I mean, you're doing this interesting stuff, designing links and things like that, or designing small computers, and you can keep that up. I mean, this is fine with them. But you cannot involve NIH or somebody else. We're a defense laboratory, you know. We don't want those people in. Interestingly enough, they now have, Lincoln Laboratory now has support from the equivalent of the medical, the NIH, medical support for research work. But at that time they did not. So therefore we had to go, that's all. And we had been blacklisted by then by everybody in the community, so we couldn't go anywhere. And that's the end of the story. So out we went. And a good part of the team went with me at the time.
When we left Lincoln Laboratory, we did then decamp to MIT proper in Cambridge for a year or two. I'm not sure exactly the length of time, where a lot of the link work went on and where the link evaluation program took place with the 12 participants. So we left MIT in 2 stages, and I think that's what Wesley refers to when he says he was fired twice by MIT.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to give it to Ivan.
I have a question for the folk who designed and used the link, which is, what did you do wrong? What were the mistakes that were made when the link was designed, which were only discovered afterwards?
I'm sure there were some things, but I think we felt pretty happy about the thing. I think you need to ask the users rather than the people that designed the thing.
Yes. Right. Right.
We did the best we could.
Bob.
I cursed those cables, and I know why you did it, so you could separate the electronics damage from parts that people actually use. But I was involved in moving links all over that building, and every time we moved, we had the 30 or 40 cables that we had to drag and run through the ceiling and stuff like that. So I hated those cables.
Those were philosophical cables. They enabled.
I like that.
They enabled us to separate out the functioning part of the computer that people were going to use. And Wes, I remember, explicitly referred to that as the computer, and the other part that had to be somewhere else as the electronics cabinet, but insisting that that was going to shrink eventually, and that would be small and would basically disappear into the rest of it, which is, of course, exactly what happened. But at that time, I think they were kept separate specifically, so the electronics cabinet could be pushed out of sight, and you could focus on the fact that there were these, basically the user's part of the machine. I think that's, at least that's what Wesley said at the time.
Well, we've run out of time, but I want to thank the panel for helping to answer the questions. Let's give them a round of applause.